Hello, my name is Marley Coyle and welcome to my webinar on differentiated instruction. Today I'm going to be talking to all of you about creating an engaging and rewarding learning environment for all of your students no matter what educational level they are at. So a little overview of what we're going to be covering today. The first thing I want to talk to you about are the ideas and theories behind differential instruction, so why it is important and why you as a teacher should practice it. Next I will discuss the different types of differentiation, so I will talk to you about how to differentiate your content, the process in which you teach, and the product you have your students put forth and demonstrate their understanding of the content. Next, we'll go over how to modify general education curriculum, and I'll give you some examples and practices that you can bring into your own classroom. And lastly, we will discuss the importance of embedding behavior and social skills into your everyday curriculum. Ideas and theories. So what I want all of you to do right now is to think to yourself why children attending school may not be making consistent academic progress. So take a second to think about that. So imagine that you're in a math class learning about how to solve two-step math equations and you don't even grasp the concept of one-step equations. You feel like you're digging yourself in a hole without any way of getting out. As teachers, we need to accommodate our lessons to match each of our students' academic levels and the ways that they learn best. Differentiated instruction, also known as DI, is an approach to effectively teach in a way that you as a teacher meet multiple learning needs of students. Instead of having just one standard lesson, you have multiple variations of the lesson to reach out to all of your students. It is important to note that your students are still learning the same curriculum, they are just taking different paths to the same end goal. This is a great quote from Hubbard. He states that teachers do not regularly implement differential instruction with fidelity largely because they do not receive the kind of professional development necessary to make a substantial change to their instruction practice. I think this goes along great with why I'm holding this webinar on differential instruction today. Another key of differential instruction is to be proactive about it. You want to start thinking about different ways to meet your students' needs before delivering the lesson, not after when your students are struggling. You want to act first, not wait until you see a student not doing well in your class. Get to know your students and take the steps to differentiate your instruction from day one. So what is DI? What does differential instruction aim to do? Differentiated instruction aims to improve learning outcomes, and that's true for all students, from your lower level students all the way up to your gifted students. If you have students that are learning above or below their learning level, they will not be receiving effective learning in the classroom. Differential instruction also aims to inspire love for learning. If students are engaged and enjoy what they're doing in school, they're going to want to put more effort into learning as opposed to doing something that does not interest them or that is too easy or too challenging for them. It also aims to increase engagement, which goes along with what I just discussed. It also helps to increase self-awareness in students. By using differential instruction practices, students become more aware of their strengths, their weaknesses, what works for them and what doesn't. It helps students to get to know themselves better and better understand their ways of learning. And lastly, it helps students learn more effectively and with deeper understanding. So if you know you have a student who struggles with reading comprehension, you can modify his or her assignment that includes reading comprehension checks while reading and not just chunk together at the end of a section or lesson. When you get to know your students and how they learn, you'll be able to teach them more effectively. So I think this graphic does a good job representing the variety of students that are found in a classroom to help explain why differential instruction is needed. In your classroom, you will find students with different needs, come from different educational backgrounds, have different interests, attention spans. English may not be their first language, and they may come from different cultural backgrounds. So think about it. If you have a child in your classroom with all these various different needs and backgrounds and abilities, how many children would find the one way you present a lesson or activity or test or project effective? These two quotes from Hepburn, Davis, and Brighton really show the diversity within a classroom. This first one says there is likely great variability from children to children in terms of appearance, physical and cognitive development, social maturity, and behaviors. They also stated that the typical public classroom contains 27 children whose academic performance levels typically span more than 5 grade levels. I found this most shocking. 5 grade levels. This is a lot of variation and diversity within one classroom. This shows that you really need to plan accordingly for those students who are on the lower and upper end of the grade levels in your classroom to help engage them in the most effective way possible. Tomlinson was one of the first people to discuss the theory of differentiated instruction, but as you can see here, there are other theories out there that help discuss diversity in the classroom. So I have them listed here, and I have links, resources next to them that are provided at the end if you wanted to do some more research. These are just some recent researches on these different practices. So before Tomlinson, Goddard discussed the theory of multiple intelligences. Personally, I think this is a very effective theory that should be implemented into every classroom. I'll go more into detail about this later in my presentation, but for now I'll just tell you that the theory of multiple intelligence differentiates human intelligence into specific modalities such as being people smart, logical smart, word smart, music smart, and more that I will discuss later on. Universal Design for Learning discusses how teachers in general education classrooms meet the needs of all the different students that are now being included into their classrooms. It allows teachers to adapt their curriculum, customize the delivery, and how they assess their students to assist them in their wide ranges of abilities. This last article by Scherer talks about moving students with disabilities from separate learning environments to inclusive environments with general education students. Scherer specifically talks about deaf students and how some deaf students believe that they're receiving the best academic preparation in an inclusive classroom setting. So these are just some theories that kind of show the diversity within classrooms and how things have changed over time. Next, we're going to talk about the different types of differentiation. There are 3 types that I'm going to talk about: content, process, and product. So differentiating content. Teachers can differentiate content in response to a student's readiness level, their interests, or their learning profiles. Readiness differentiation involves matching material students are asked to learn to their capacity to read and understand it. As a teacher, you want to match the starting point of the content to a student's readiness level. It's important to closely monitor students' learning as their readiness level changes, because then the student will then move to a different readiness group. Tomlinson provides the example of it being inappropriate to ask a student who speaks or reads little English to read from a grade level U.S. history book. As a teacher, you want to ask yourself if the materials you are providing for your students are appropriate challenging level in regards to complexity, independence, pacing, etc. Content can also be differentiated by student interest. You want to keep your students' interests in mind while planning lessons. For example, you can give a student a survey to rate what they find interesting and group the students by their interest. If you know one student is in a comedy in your classroom, you would allow that student to use humor in the classroom, whether it be read parts of a story that include humor or allowing them to do some type of skit. So you want to match different activities based on different students' interests. Lastly, you can differentiate content by learning profiles. This means that teachers match the way that material is approached to the student's preferred learning style. For example, in an English class, if you're reading a book, you can group your students by their learning profiles in regard to how they prefer to read. You can group them by their preferences, such as preferring to read independently in a quiet place, listening to an audiobook, having a teacher read aloud while the students follow along, etc. If a student has an auditory processing disorder and is forced to read along while the teacher reads aloud, they could become lost or confused and not have the comprehension necessary to understand the text that they use in audiobook. Or whereas if they use an audiobook, they can go at their own pace. This is super important to match what the student is expected to do with how they learn best. Next, you can differentiate the process. Tomlinson refers to the process as the opportunity for learners to process the content or ideas and skills which are presented to them. He states that when students encounter new ideas, information, or skills, they need time to run their input through their own filters of meaning. So students must understand the concepts of underlying principles of the basics before they move on to complex learning. For example, Tomlinson states that students who already understand how to convert fractions into decimals don't need to do an activity designed to help make sense of the underlying principles. They've already processed and made sense of those ideas. They are now ready to move on to more complex topic. On the other hand, if a student does not fully understand fractions, They are not ready to move on to an activity designed to understand converting fractions into decimals. They first need to master the concept and underlying principles of fractions, such as completing an activity on whole and part. Students must understand the concepts and underlying principles of the basics before they move on to more complex learning. Overall, the point of differentiating process is to help students progress from their current point of understanding to a more complex point of understanding. As an educator, you can differentiate products. According to Tomlinson, products should help students rethink, use, and extend what they have learned over a long period of time, such as in a unit, a semester, or over the course of the entire year. When you are planning products, it's important to remember that you are using the same content and process, but using different product assignments to different students based on their understanding of the unit. For example, if they're teaching an art unit on different styles of art, a teacher can assign 3 different products based on the student's understanding of the unit. One project can create a flip book based on several artists and show the artist's style on each page. Next step up would be to make a pop-up art project based on 4 different artists and their styles of art. A last product could be to create a pop-up book. In this assignment, students would be asked to blend together 2 different artist styles to illustrate a story using a pop-up book. These 3 different products vary from having few facets to many facets and allowing students to choose the product that is just right for them, not being too easy or too hard. It's important to note that these products are good replacements for standard multiple choice fill in the blank test. They allow students to be creative and engaged in what they're doing and pull together what they have learned during a unit or a semester. Now we're going to discuss how to modify general education curriculum. These are different tips on how to differentiate your instruction. As a teacher, you want to be clear on the key concepts and generalizations that give meaning and structure to the topic, chapter, or unit that you are planning. What this means is that you have your lessons focus on key ideas and meanings, not present information here from multiple different topics. By focusing on key concepts and generalizations, you can ensure that learners gain understanding of the building blocks to access other knowledge. You also want to think of assessments as a roadmap for thinking and planning. As I stated earlier, some students need to take different paths to get to the same end goal. You want to keep this in mind during your planning. By thinking of how assessments as roadmaps, you are providing an array of ways to allow students to demonstrate their understanding and skills. Assessments are then seen as an extension of knowledge, not just a measure of how much has learned. A very important tip is to make sure your lessons are engaging for all your students. This is something you should strive to do within all lessons. You want to keep your students engaged by presenting them with materials and activities that fit their educational levels and learning profiles, as we previously discussed today. My last tip here for you is to have a balance between student-selected and teacher-assigned tasks in the classroom. This will vary for each student, but for the most part, students should be regularly making choices for themselves, but also be matched with tasks that fit their needs. This helps improve student self-awareness as well. While creating a lesson plan, there are 3 steps that you want to keep in mind. First, you want to think about your learners. This means that you want to consider things such as your student culture, language, ethnicity, strengths, weaknesses, and needs and preferences when creating a lesson plan. As I've stated before, it is imperative that you get to know your students. You get to know all of the things about your students so that you're able to create a lesson for them that is able to reach them and be engaging in providing learning opportunities. If you do not think your students' strengths and weaknesses and needs and preferences when creating a lesson plan, you're creating a lesson plan for an ideal student. You're not taking into account the diversity of students within your classroom. Next, you need to think about the possible barriers that your students may have. Some barriers may include attention spans, lack of motivation, troubles with memory, language barriers, and transitional skills. For example, if you normally have none, 1, or 2 English learners in your classroom, but this year you have 7 or 8, you need to accommodate for that change in the way that you've previously done your lesson to fit the needs of these students. If a student has a hard time with memory, you may want to include special parts in your lesson to accommodate that student. Differentiated instruction is all about getting to know your students and providing them with the instruction to overcome these barriers and get them to learn in the most efficient way possible. Lastly, while creating a lesson plan, you want to think about these different factors: your goals for the lesson, what materials and resources that you want to use, how you're going to teach the material, and how you're going to assess or grade the product.